I thought a few things. You know, we need to sort of make sure that we're clear on the rules tonight, but first, you know, we need to bond a little bit. So I thought, John, that I should mention that we both grew up on farms.
Yeah.
Like, so how good's that? That's a lot in common, really.
Yeah.
That's a good start. Couldn't find much else, but that was good. And then Peter Costello, I thought, look, you've got 3 children, so do I. Okay? And it was a federal policy at the time I was having kids. I think you had to have one for the country. So I did make sure that we did our duty. But there are some...
One for mum, one for dad, and then
one for the country. That's right.
But,
so, yes.
But Winston Churchill said you need 4, 1 for a spare.
Well, we got a dog. I figured it had more legs and it was cheaper.
Does it pay taxes?
Yeah, no. It's contributing in other ways. You do need to avoid political phrases, all right? We don't want to hear, now let me say this, all right? And try and avoid strong and, words like stable, I guess. So that's another one we hear quite a bit. It's very easy as former pollies, though. We expect you to just know how to answer a question very directly. So that'll be easy. So, finding hope in politics is the conversation tonight. What does it make you both think when you hear that? Is it fair to be able to connect hope and politics? John, what's your thoughts?
Well, if there is no hope of restoring hope to politics, there is no hope. But let me make this point. Did I just say something I'm not allowed to? I probably did. I fell into it very quickly.
That's right, yes.
He's had
it's
a long
very
time
stable situation, wasn't it?
But the data shows what the seat of the pants feeling tells you. Levels of distrust in the system, including in politics in Australia, is running at absolutely unprecedented levels. The ANU's work shows that. The Royal Commission of Inquiry into the banks is adding to that angst. The other thing that is happening is that we are polarising horribly as a people. And the number of people now who identify as left-wing in this country is growing quite rapidly. But 2/3 of Australians still do not identify as left-wing, and yet the left dominate all of the conversation. They've got all the high points of our culture. They've got the Greens, they've got the Labor Party, I'd be careful where I say here. They've got the universities, they've got academia, they've got the media, they've got half the business community, it seems now. They've got GetUp, they've got the unions. Who speaks for moderate and conservative Australians? And I wonder how good this is for democracy. We have to fix that. And, okay, you didn't say I couldn't say something corny, but when I say something corny, I mean it. I came down here, Gaelle, when you asked me to support you because I actually believe in the end, we trust people. And Gaelle is the person I trust and that I believe the people in this electorate can trust.
Yeah.
All right, I'll pay him later. Am I allowed to say that? No,
I'm
kidding. I'm kidding. So, Peter, what's your thoughts?
Well, I think we've just found our hope in politics, haven't we?
All right, thanks. All right, let's have supper. Yeah, no, good.
Let's go to supper.
Good.
Yeah, if you said to me, can you find hope in politics, I'd answer it this way. I mean, what do you want politics to do? And I remember sitting in I was elected for 20 years as a federal MP. I served in government for just under 12 years. So I sat in cabinet cabinet is the supreme decision-making body in Australia for 12 years. And I remember one day we were sitting around there and we all talking about the fact that we were worried about marriage breakdown. And, you know, what could we do about it? And, you know, I remember, well, what can we do about it in a cabinet? We can't make husbands and wives love each other. You can't pass a law. Every husband will love every wife will love every husband. What can you do about it? And, you know, we came to the conclusion that we could have services on marriage preparation, maybe marriage counselling, those sorts of things. You've got to ask yourself, what do you want politics to do? And I'd say politics is good at some things. A government can tax, does that very well, and it can spend.
Does that pretty well too.
It does that.
Especially
it does
these
that
days.
too well at the moment. You know, a government can pass laws, and they can influence behaviour. But a government's never going to give you meaning in your personal life, or meaning in your marriage, or you know, I would say keep your kids on the straight and narrow. If you're asking the government to do those sorts of things, you're looking in the wrong place, really. You know, you've got to look to individuals and individual morality and relationships and churches to do that kind of thing. And in a funny kind of way, I feel that many people are asking government to do too much these days. So they're asking it to do things it can't possibly succeed at. And then when it doesn't succeed, they say, oh, look how hopeless government is. And I think we'd be a lot better if the government concentrated on fewer things and did them well, right? Rather than pretending it can solve every problem and doing it extremely badly. So can we find hope in politics? I think with wise and mature people, we could get good economic management, we could get laws, we could get security, we could get safe communities, we could get investment, we could get a good health system, we could get a good education system, we could get all those sorts of things. Will we find meaning in life? No. Will we find healed relationships? No. Because politics can't do that kind of thing. And I'm a very big believer actually in limited government. That is, government should be limited to, and we should be very clear about what we want our government to do, rather than try and do everything. And you know, I'm not saying the government's doing everything well at the moment, but the more you ask it for, the less well it's likely to do, in my view.
I think I agree with what Peter's just said, but there's a great battle for the soul of the nation going on here, really, because the left that I've just talked about is in a way clamouring for government to do more and more and more and more. And you particularly see it in, to be blunt, the attempt to displace the role and responsibilities of parents for our children. Now, I actually think that's very dangerous, and we need to remember that, in fact, in a democracy, government should be downstream of culture. Culture should shape government, and government should be responsive to that culture. But if the culture loses its way, and as Peter has said, people start to demand things of government that are not the natural and proper place of government to provide, the disappointment breeds more and more cynicism, and then trust breaks down. And when trust breaks down, and this is a huge issue in Australia today, as I mentioned a moment ago, people flee for security. It's very interesting. So they don't trust the government that they elect, they jam the system in the Senate because they don't trust the government they just elected. That's what we're doing. When they don't trust the banks, and we don't trust our neighbours, and we're not sure about our institutions, we run for the law book and demand that governments pass a whole lot of laws to make institutions and people do what they ought to do voluntarily, to coerce them to do it. And guess what? You're eroding your democratic freedoms. That's what's happening.
I just want to make one point about that on the laws too, which I think John's absolutely right. And I'll give you a practical example. I used to administer the tax system. Let's say there are 15 million taxpayers in Australia. The proportion of people that are actually audited on their tax returns, you'd be lucky if it was 2%. Right? The tax system will work as long as you can rely on a very large proportion of people acting honestly in their dealings. But if you can't rely on that, you cannot send someone round to audit every person. You would spend more money auditing than all you'd ever raise, right? So there's the law, but there's also the personal moral position of the citizens. And you rely on that in so many areas. Tax is just one other area. I mean, the truth of the matter is if every person in Australia decided to burgle their neighbours, the police couldn't stop it. Right? We rely on an understanding of the ordinary moral decency of people not to go burgling their neighbours, because otherwise we've got 15 million burglaries happening every day, you know, in jails that we can't fill. And, you know, I think this is the point that John's making, is if moral consensus breaks down, you can't expect laws to fix it, right? Laws can only go so far. Maybe we can pick up everybody who murders someone, but we can't pick up, you know, everybody who cheats on their tax return. And I think this is the important thing about governments. I mean, in some respects, governments lead morality. In another respect, governments reflect morality, right? So if morality is starting to break down, generally, should we be surprised if we see that reflected in our governments? Should we be surprised? No, because
not in a democracy.
In a democracy, they're reflecting the moral consensus. Now, in some respects, they can lead it, but in many other respects, they're just reflecting it. And you know, I agree with what John said. You know, where does the leadership come from? You know, it's much more than looking to politics for your leadership. This is the point I'm trying to make. You know, politics can lead in some respects, but in many respects it just reflects. So if you think people in Parliament, you know, aren't doing the right thing on their allowances, or they're not treating their staff well, or, you know, they're getting their staff to pick up the dog poo, or whatever it is, you know, whatever happens to be the issue of the day, right? I mean, these people are quite reflective of what's happening in society at the moment. And, you know, you've got a much bigger issue, I think, than just changing your politics with what's going on at the moment in Australia and generally the world and the West.
So how do you choose the right people to get in order to influence change? John?
Yeah, I think in essence you're asking how do you decide who you can trust? You know, I think that's a really good question. And I've often been asked that. And I gave an answer in Yeppoon in Queensland once when I was acting Prime Minister, and what I didn't know was that there was a journalist from an organisation, Peter, that you're getting to know quite well at the moment, literally hiding behind a pot plant. Literally. And I made the comment that it's a good and legitimate and hard question to answer. I said my observation would be that if you can trust people with little things, and if the people around that person, say it's a candidate for office like you, if the people around you and your immediate family, the people who know you best, your local community, if they feel they can trust you with the things that you've been entrusted with, there's a pretty high chance you can be trusted more broadly. And anyway, the Fairfax reporter hiding behind the pot plant, and I kid you not, that's what was happening. About 2 weeks later, you know, turned it into something prurient, arguing that I'd been saying that if a husband couldn't be trusted by a wife when he was a politician, you know, the electorate, I hadn't said that at all. I'll tell you what I'd had in mind. I'd once saw an aspirant to very high office disconnect the speedo in his car. And I thought, this man aspires to run the finances of a certain state in New South Wales, I won't say any more, but for his own financial gain, he's seeking to preserve the value of his car. I wouldn't trust him with the state's finances. You see the point? Yes. And yet I was ridiculed. What was interesting, actually, some of the talkback shows opened up their lines on it, and what was fascinating was that the people agreed with me. They got it. Which is why they support the bonking ban, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to look at you.
I'm a great supporter of the bonking ban. I don't know why you look at me when you talk about the bonking ban.
But you see, but my point out of that is that the surveys show, I mean, it's an absurdity in a way. You shouldn't have to do it, should you?
What, bonk?
No, tell people that they shouldn't misbehave in that way.
Well, you know,
well, look, you know the background.
If you need to be told, really, I mean, you've...
But the point I wanted to draw out of this, the Australian people approved of it. Why? Because they get if you can't be trusted in that situation. We've got doubts about whether we can trust you with running the country. And
Well, I
they've
think the point that you're making is right. Is character is important. I think character is important. You know, and let's go outside Australia.
So he was educated in Melbourne. I can't keep up. I came up from a little bush school up there in the north.
Character, and this is why, for example, in America, they'll spend a lot of time, talking about. Remember with Obama, the pastor at his church was preaching inflammatory sermons, right? And I said, what does that matter? Well, it gives you an insight into character, right? And so that's relevant. And they'll spend a lot of time looking at character, and character, I think, is relevant. And I'll tell you why it's relevant, because when you get into office, there are some issues that you cannot contemplate will ever come up. And you will have to make a decision, and it'll have to be instantaneous. And I'll give you an example, and one's John's very familiar with, right? Just take obvious ones, go outside our country. George W. Bush didn't think when he was going to become president that there would be an attack on the World Trade Center. That was the most unexpected thing imaginable, right? And nobody had announced a policy in that election as to what they would do if there was an attack on the World Trade Center. Nobody had announced because nobody thought it was going to happen. But he was confronted with that, and he had to make a decision about how to respond. There'll be a million issues that will come up before a government, a million issues which you have never anticipated. And you won't have a policy on them. You'll have to make judgments, and you'll have to make them very quickly. And that's why I think character is important. You want to know the character of the person that will be making those decisions, right? And nothing will have prepared you in advance for how they're going to react. So I'm not saying character's the only issue, but it's a jolly important one. Policy is very important. I agree with that. I'd say record is important, because anyone can say what their policy is. I always used to say, I look at the opposition, I say, don't listen to what they say. Look what they do. You want to know what they're going to do? You look what they did last time. So policy is important, I think. Experience, track record. But then I think, and I agree with John, character, because that's for all those unforeseen things that we don't know that are going to come up.
It's the essential ingredient. Leadership can consist and involve many different characteristics, many different qualities, many different abilities, but the one essential for any effective leader, I believe, is character.
Now, both of you are fairly young-ish, in your 30s when you entered into Parliament. But talking about those big moments, my understanding is John...
I knew I liked it.
Yeah, well, John Howard, he was overseas. You were Deputy Prime Minister at the time. The TVs flick on and we see planes going into the Twin Towers. Now, you get a call after having a couple of very sleepless nights, a couple of hours sleep, next night a few hours sleep, and then you're going to bed at 11 o'clock and then this is what you get woken up with. How do you cope with that kind of responsibility? Not everyone wants to run a country, but how do you handle that responsibility at the time?
Well, it was a pretty interesting week, because I'd got a call at 6 o'clock Sunday morning from New Zealand, from the chairman and the CEO of Air New Zealand, saying Ansett broke. They owned Ansett. Okay, it was a New Zealand airline. People forget that. I said that in front of a vast audience in Melbourne one day at a massive church I was talking at, and somebody in the peanut gallery called out, "You be nice to the New Zealanders." And somebody over here shot back, "Why? It's not as if they're going to go home," which I thought was a bit rough. But anyway, so we'd worked literally through, and Peter was in town as treasurer as well at that time, and we were doing a lot of talking. And that called for judgment, because it was tough. It would have been easy just to have used a whole lot of your taxpayers' money to bail the thing out. But actually there was an incredibly important policy principle here, which was that in fact the industry needed rationalisation, and more people fly for less than ever now, because some tough decisions were made. They weren't necessarily popular at the time. But on that night, we'd worked through the 2 previous nights. I'd probably only had 3 or 4 hours sleep in the last in the previous 2.5, 3 days, and I was dog tired, I have to say. And my press secretary rang. I was in a strange motel. Couldn't get the television to work because the batteries in the remote are flat. Can you believe it? The little things that happen. And I finally get it on, turning it on manually, fumbling around in the dark through the fog of fatigue, and you think, good grief, what is this? The beginning of something really cataclysmic. We didn't even know for a little while where the PM was. What was then Defence Signals Directorate, DSD, it's now ASD, I think, Australian Signals Directorate, but they came straight through to me with a 5-digit number from a mobile phone, and I had the clearest line I've ever had on a telephone with the Prime Minister, who was then in the basement of the embassy in Washington, and he was okay. And then it took 3 or 4 days to get him home. It was a very interesting and concerning time. Such counter-terrorism arrangements as had been designed in Australia, mainly by the former Governor-General Mike Jeffries and Jim Wallace. They were the people who designed the counter-terrorism measures that were triggered that night. They were triggered. There were all sorts of incidents happening all night. Parliament House was cordoned off, went back in the next morning. I do occasionally tell the story that at that time I remember praying quite earnestly, and I say this because it's true, and I'm happy to share it now, that I could put self-interest aside, and feeling confident that this would be the end of my career and possibly the government, and goodness only knows what else. I needed nonetheless to put any self-interest aside and recognise I had a job to do. You can't jump off the bridge the way a certain Latin ship captain did when things got hot. You can't do it. You're there. You've got to face that responsibility. And the interesting thing about that is that I felt an enormous calm over it, and one of my major senior political advisors at the time, still to this day, says, that was the worst week I worked for you for 7 years, and you were at your calmest. And I don't say that in any desire to try and boast, just that I believe in the power of prayer. And forgive me for prolonging this, how many of you have seen the movie Dunkirk or The Darkest Hour? Both centring on Dunkirk. Aren't they remarkable? But they leave out something that every student of history and everyone who lived through that knew. It was called the Dunkirk miracle. The current Queen's father, King George VI, when it was realised the entire British Army was on the other side of the sea, they'd lost all their equipment and they were being slaughtered, called the National Day of Prayer. You can go and Google it now. There were queues for miles long right across Britain as people sought to get into the churches. And they were asked to pray for mercy and for forgiveness and for the recovery of their troops. 4 things happened, for those of you who doubt the power of prayer. The stillest water that any sailors had ever seen descended on the Channel for several days. The cloud cover came in. The Luftwaffe couldn't operate against that fleet of little boats. They got not the 25,000 people they'd hoped to recover. They got 338,000 back. And the 4th thing that happened that people overlook was amongst the people they saved was the man who really masterminded victory along with George Marshall, and that was Lord Allenbrook. So I'd be very slow to doubt the efficacy of prayer, even if you are cynical.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we've been talking a little bit about leadership, and I think some of the biggest challenges we face in life can be our biggest successes in many ways, but you can sometimes chart the low points and see how it's helped you. They've done research that sort of shows post-traumatic stress, instead of stress in some situations, it's post-traumatic growth. Now, you've both been through politics, so maybe there's some post-traumatic growth from that experience. But Peter, can you share perhaps some challenges or a challenge that you've faced in your life that you have felt has spurred you on in your journey, either in politics or in life?
My goodness, that's a tough one.
Dealing with the National Party.
It was a challenge. Don't know that it spurred me on, though. Yeah, I think you've heard it said before that it's the times that you get knocked down that you actually learn, in a personal sense, and when you see real character emerge, and I've been through challenges at the personal level and at the political level that have actually changed me for the better, I think. We've had... The thing about politics, by the way, is you have moments of great elation and then you have moments of disaster. For me personally, the 2007 election, we'd been in office for 12 years. 10 surplus budgets, paid off all the government's debt. We had unemployment down to 3%. We had the credit rating fixed up. But here's the point: we had money in the future fund, and the public said, "We're bored with you. Shuffle off the stage." I mean, we'd like to give Kevin Rudd a go, and that's when I lost confidence in the Australian electorate. I thought, what more can you do? And so that was very, very hard for me to return to Parliament and basically see everything that you'd worked for torn down again. And it's not that you want people to be grateful.
It helps, though.
No, I don't. Paul Keating once said they should put statues of him up in every country town, he said. They should have statues to me. I never wanted statues to me, but I felt that if I had paid off all government debt, this would be a gift to generations, right? To generations. And that would be there for my kids and grandkids, and they would be free of debt, and they'd have a go in life, and they'd be in the strongest position of any country in the world. And, now I look at it, and we're 10 years later, and we're right back with every dollar of debt that we paid off has been borrowed again, and more. And you think to yourself, we worked so hard to get there, and then it's all been turned around. So, what do you learn from that? Well, the one thing that I console myself is I say it's bad now, right? But imagine if we hadn't paid off the debt. Right? We'd have had all that accumulated debt and what's happened since 2007 as well. Where would we be now? Our country would, if you think it's in, a difficult position now, it would be in a dreadful condition if we hadn't have done that. And so, coming to grips with those things, trying to learn from them. The one thing I learned from politics is if you voted out, you can't say to the electorate, we were right and you were wrong, right? Because in a democracy, the electorate's king. You just got to take the verdict, and you've got to move on, and you've got to do what you feel where you can make a contribution next. And that was very hard for me. 2007, extremely hard. John had left by this stage. Most of the people that I'd been there all the time with had left, and I don't think you don't have to agree with me on this, but I think when history is written, the last 10 years won't be written as well as what happened in the 10 years before it. I think history will be the judge of that.
Now, politics is a gruelling game. I read that you had a resignation letter in your top pocket for a while, and your wife, Julia, had said the resignation was not a matter of if, but when. There was a night, apparently, where the two of you went out for dinner, and Peter encouraged you to stay. Do you want to talk more about that? Is that factual in the books?
Not quite, I don't think. Peter might have a different recollection, but...
it's your life.
Not quite sure what that means. No, I don't know that it quite played out like that. There were moments, there were some pretty tense moments. I sometimes felt that I was completely at odds with my own leader when I was deputy leader on economic policy. And we had some difficulties. But I'll say this about character. As a government, we worked together. There was loyalty. And I think Peter would be the first to say that he had tremendous support from members of the ERC over the years. And it was a dog's job, really. 11th of March 1996, and Howard set up the Razor Gang. You effectively ran it with John Fay, and there were 3 others of us. 3 of us were under 40 when you look back on it. That's amazing. And there were many ingredients to its eventual success, hard work as it was. But it goes to the issue of character again, loyalty to one another. In work where it would have been very easy to do what happens today, the minute you want to stop something that you don't like, you just leak it. Didn't happen. We sort of hung together until we'd got through together. I think that's fair.
Fair point.
So, Peter, did you ever wake up and wonder, why didn't I do a different occupation?
Yeah, you know, mate, the trouble with politics, and let me tell you, is unbelievable highs. You know, you really feel you're doing something for your country, doing something for your fellow citizens. And then there's unbelievable lows when you have a failure and it's so public, absolutely public, you know. There's no point in hiding because you're on the front page of every newspaper. And, you know, there were mornings, you know, where I wake up at 3 a.m. knowing that I could hear the newspapers going, the paper boy was throwing them on the front lawns, going down the street. I'd hear plop, 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 and I knew every one of my neighbours was going to read about what a shocking person I was this day. You know, because I knew my picture was going to be on the front page of the paper, and it was like terrible things. My poor old neighbours are going to read it again. And my kids are going to read it, and my poor old mother, I mean, she'd sort of ring up, oh, what have you done this time? And you know, everybody's talking about it now. And how do you explain these things? You don't worry, Mum, don't worry. That's what you say all the time. So, yeah, I mean, those days, you just want to hide. And, you know, you walk past the newsagent and there's your photo, you know, from every newspaper. And you would say, you know, why can't I just go and live on a Greek island or something like that? But, yeah, the other thing that you sort of learn after a while, and I think it's an important thing, is the public doesn't really take it in, you know, that you'd see people, you know, people would come up to you and say, I saw you on TV last night, and you know, oh, here it goes. You had a nice tie on. You know, this happened to me a number of occasions. I say, oh, really? Yeah, nice tie. And that's all they'd remember. It's great.
It's great. Now, John, you are considered a man with integrity, a lot of integrity. But there was a time where you were called the most detested man in Australia, and yeah. You're in the car, the radio goes on, and your kids hear this. When you are a dad, and both of you are in this situation, how hard is it when politicians do get attacked all the time to keep that sort of private, public life separate?
It can be very difficult. The moment you were referring to was, it was over the question of free trade. And we faced a really difficult situation. We'd signed up to a global set of rules that said that you could keep other food products out from other countries if there were phytosanitary problems, i.e. it wasn't healthy or whatever. But otherwise, you had to allow for free trade. And it was, I can reveal this now, but Canada was the real problem because we're good friends with Canada. And the Canadian Trade Commissioner came to me and said, John, if you people in this country decide not to take our pork, we're not going to make a fuss of it. I want to tell you now, we're not actually going to drag you before the WTO. But just remember that at the moment, we're taking $400 million worth of your product every year and you're taking $30 million of ours. and our sugar and our wine contracts, which are worth about 300 million of the 400 million next year, there will be no retribution in it. They just won't come to Australia. No, I heard someone say blackmail. I'm not so sure, because all he was trying to do was to say, well, if there's no health reason for keeping our pork out, why would we trade with you? Why would we not trade with somebody who will trade with us? That's what he was really saying. He was a fine man. I have no personal objection to him. He was doing his country's bidding. Anyway, so the very difficult decision was made. And of course, you know, I was a farmer myself, so I felt it. Although, you see, as a beef producer, there were no restrictions on beef coming in to compete with my beef. None. The pork industry had protection, and it was very, very tough for it. I'd be the first to say that. But that's what it was over. And a group of pork producers in Queensland, in Paul Neville's electorate, had demanded that the Prime Minister go up and see them to complain about me. And they played the meeting live over the radio, and I wasn't able to turn it off quickly enough. And I've got 4 little kids listening to some bloke standing up in front of John Howard saying, "Your Minister for Primary Industries, John Anderson, is the most hated man in Australia today." Now, those things are tough. And, you know, I tried to be a fierce advocate for rural and regional Australia and for agricultural policy. But I have to say to you, the trade one was very, very tough. It was really tough. Trade is a two-way business. We were exporting vastly more than we were importing by value, vastly more. But there were countries lining up to say, you know, we have options if you're not going to trade in good faith. And it was, frankly, that you talk about challenges. I found that unbelievably difficult. I really did, because of course I wanted to help farmers. But what do you do? I mean, the Australian dairy industry, to its great credit, spent a vast amount of money taking out full-page ads saying John Anderson is right, we have to have a rules-based system. We now employ 100,000 people, mostly in Victoria, on the back of exports. Don't do things that will have other countries closing their markets to us. It is a two-way business, but it was no fun. I'll tell you what it did do, and I'm sure Peter would say the same thing. I have 4 children. They can read people like a book. It gave them an incredible ability to read character.
Well, that is a good lesson to learn. Now, just...
Which one?
Yeah, the judging of good character. But look, Peter, I'm keen to ask you, with the growing number of swinging voters today, do you think that politics is less about ideology, and are governments looking at buying people's votes now more than they ever have before?
So, come to the last election in 2016. It was a double dissolution election. The Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, called a double dissolution, he said, because minority senators were blocking the government's program and it was time to clear the minorities. You remember we had all those people, Jackie Lambie and, you know, the guy from the motorsports, you know, I can't even remember all their names now. A lot of them, you know, in the Senate. He said it's time to clean them out. And you know what happened in that election 2016? They voted more independents back into the Senate than have ever been in the Senate before. Between Greens, One Nation, Xenophon, Pauline Hanson, a third of the Senate were independents. And this is basically what's happening now. Once upon a time, the 2 major parties, Labor, the coalition, would get about 45% of the vote each. And then there'd be 10% swinging or going off to minors. What's changed is they're now both down low 30s. They're about 32, 33 each. And there's a third that's going off to independents and minor parties. So the number of independents and minor parties is growing. The public might say they don't like it, but they keep voting, particularly in the Senate, for independents and minor parties. So that is quite unstable. So that's the answer to the first part of your question. The second part of your question is, you know, like I'm a treasurer. You know, we're a sort of weird breed because, and John will tell you this, he would have sat through every cabinet meeting. Every time there was a plan to spend money, I would oppose it. And mostly I'd lose 16-1 when they all ganged up against me. But I'd always go down fighting, you know. And
you won quite a few of them.
Yeah, I won a few of them.
And you had quite a bit of support on some
Sometimes
of
I did, sometimes from good people.
I am a Scot.
You know, but you got to remember, you know, there's money that's being, it's not created. It's somebody else's money. All the government's doing is taking from one group of people and distributing to others. You got to bear that all in mind. And you know, someone said the thing about governments, they try and bribe you with your own money. They take it from you and then they try and bribe you by giving some of it back. And you know, that's not to say that, you know, redistribution is wrong. You know, there is a case for redistribution, and we redistribute in very, very important places. That's obvious. But you know, I just do feel that you got to always remember that the government doesn't create money. The money that the government spends is somebody else's taxes. Just got to remember that. And I think governments have got to be careful with other people's taxes. I'd like to see them a lot more careful with other people's taxes than is often the case. So, you know, just bear that in mind when the government comes around and says we're going to give a grant here and a grant there and a grant. You got to remember they didn't create the money. You know, it's somebody else's taxes that they're actually distributing. And so how do we resolve all of this? I always thought the most important thing was to sort of try and shoot for a bigger principle. So we've got to have a bigger principle behind this that we can unite people. So I try and unite people around the idea of a balanced budget. We're not going to spend any more than we raise. I would try and unite people around the idea of low debt. We're going to pay off debt rather than rev it up. Because debt's just this generation taking from the next. That's all it is. You've got to remember that. If the government's borrowing, the money doesn't go away. It's just we just leave it to our kids. It's debt. Government debt is just a way of this generation stealing from the next. That's all it is. So we'll try and unite them around that. And you know, for a while we did pretty well. We did. We led the world, and I think we united people around those principles. You know, we haven't balanced the budget in the last 12 years. And you know, the debts, so we had to borrow, all the debts all come back. And, you know, that means that the kids of today will have a less bright future than they would have had. Just got to understand that.
It's a staggering thing that Deloitte's have just done a major survey of young Australians. 92% of young Australians believe they will not have the same employment and lifestyle opportunities that their parents had. You go to Indonesia and the numbers are reversed. 92% think they'll do better than their parents. But I'd like to pick up on this idea of ideology. I actually think that you hear people say, oh, the major parties are all the same and so forth. I actually think it's a bit more complicated than that. I actually think you can mount an argument that there are very, very deep philosophical differences emerging in Australia. At its most basic, I think I would say now that, dare I mention his name, Mr. Trump has a point. There's fake news and real news. And we choose now what we want to believe, not on the evidence, but on what suits us. And so we know now that in the age of social media, where around 50% of Americans get all of their information now from social media, not the mainstream media, that bad news and fake news, don't ask me how they work this out, but it can be done, it travels 6 times faster than accurate news. Can you believe that? And if it's emotively laden, the Howard fascist government today is responsible for the death of Mrs. Smith in a nursing home because of climate change, and they wouldn't do anything about it. It travels 70% faster again. So this is pretty extraordinary stuff. Now, the breaking of trust that I touched on earlier, I think is very deep in the Australian community. And when trust is broken in the political system in Australia, one of the things you can do is you can elect a government without any enthusiasm, because that's what's happening. There used to be a surge of confidence and trust at federal election times. There was one in 1996, there was another one in 2007. They thought, we've got rid of a tired government, fresh start, we'll invest our trust in them. The last few elections, there's been no change. The distrust has just continued to rise and rise and rise and rise. We're in uncharted waters. So one of the strange things we're doing is we're jamming the system by making sure the Senate doesn't let a government govern. But it goes much further than that. When we don't feel that people are doing what they should do voluntarily, we run for the law book. Now, I just want to say to you that I actually think ideology is playing a bigger role now than we think it is on the surface of it. Take energy. And I'm a farmer. Energy can make up 1/3 of a farmer's costs, directly and indirectly. 1/3. It's even more for the value-adding sector, which is a huge part of the industrial base of Australia, value-adding agricultural product and exporting it. We've been going really well, but we're being killed by energy costs. Now, I think it's an interesting illustration. There's 3 ways in which trust has been eroded over the last 10 years when we've gone from the world's cheapest, most reliable electricity to the world OECD's most expensive, I think it is now, and one of the less reliable. There are third world countries that have more reliable electricity than Australia.
South Australia is the most expensive in the world.
Yeah, well, there you go. Now, there's 3 things that have contributed to massive distrust here. One is, it looks incompetent, doesn't it? Governments look as though they haven't known what they're doing and it's been chaotic and there's been consequences that they didn't understand, so they're incompetent. That breaks our trust, does it not? Secondly, you get the distinct impression that there were people who understood the consequences but didn't have the courage to tell you. So what does that do? It erodes your confidence even more, doesn't it? But then there's the third one, the ideological one. There is no doubt that there were many people who were pushing for responses to greenhouse gas emissions in this country who had a deep ideological commitment, not to environmental issues, but to smashing the Australian economy. I actually really do believe that. There are people who think we should deindustrialise and take all the job losses and turn ourselves into an economy where people either work for the government or they work in the services sector pouring coffee. Now, it's important to have people in both roles, but you can't build a whole economy on it. And I think the Australian people are starting to sense that there have been people who have been deliberately wanting to smash our system. What does that do? Erode confidence and trust even more. I say to you, we have a crisis of trust in Australia today. And if we can't defeat it, then the question of hope in government looks very thin indeed.
Now, interested, yes. Since the 1980s, I guess we've seen privatisation of a number of services that were perhaps once delivered by government, so government may be more involved in administering contracts, but how does that then go to what governments actually have control of? Do they have control of things and how?
Well, in Australia, a state government, for example, will be responsible for policing, schools, transport, those sorts of things, hospitals. Do they have control of them? Yes, they do. I mean, the schools are run out of the education department. The hospitals are run by hospital boards. The police is run by a commissioner who answers to the government. I mean, they have real control. And privatisation hasn't really affected that. At the federal level, of course, you think of what the federal government does. As I said, tax, spend, pensions, Medicare, defence, foreign relations, interest rate policy, corporate regulation. I mean, a government has overall control of that. If you're a minister up here, you know, you can't get to an individual decision down there. You might have too many people, and maybe nor should you. but you do have overall control of these things. I mean, the hard thing is, I think, designing accountability and holding people to it. I think this is the thing that gets you about government is people will promise you the world, but how do you ever make them accountable for the delivery at the end of it? I mean, ultimately, the only thing you can do is vote them out. Then the mob that comes in might be even worse. So what do you do then? Where do you go? I wouldn't say this is a problem of privatisation. I would say it's a problem of delivery, and I would say it's a problem of accountability. Now, I make one thing about, and John's made the point about trust. I always thought a government's at its best when it under-promises and over-delivers. Then you can build trust. And that's what I always tried to do. Don't promise them the world. Promise what you think you can actually do and deliver it. And then you've got trust. But we're in the business of over-promising and under-delivering.
But also hiding our real motives.
Maybe. But governments is promising all sorts of stuff. They're telling you, now the government's telling you what it's going to do in 2026, right? 2020. Really? In 2026? They can't deliver something yesterday, and now they're going to tell you what they'll do in 2026? The one thing we know in 2026, most of the people won't be in the government then. These promises that are sort of 10 years on the never. Why bother? Why bother? Anybody here know what the economy is going to be like in 2026? Anybody know? I don't. I mean, anybody know what's going to be our defence situation is going to be like? What our terrorism situation is going to be like? I think they've made a rod for their own back with these big promises on the never, and nobody really trusts delivery now. And I think this is a big error. So I'm more a limited government man. This is where I started. Why not just focus on the things that we can do, right, and deliver on them before we start promising all sorts of things that we can't do?
Now, just want to touch on the media too, because the media has a lot of sway potentially. Now we have more media opportunities, messages, channels, social media, so people are getting their news from a number of different sources. John, what's your view? Is the media today making governments more reactive, like their focus is responding to media and their focus on the media rather than developing good policy? What do you think?
It's a complicated question made massively more difficult by the advent of social media, which is killing mainstream media and hollowing it out. But then the problem is that in many ways it had hollowed out its own intellectual depth and diversity of perspectives anyway. So I'm afraid I find it hard to be terribly kind to the media in general, even though I count a limited number of journalists as good friends and think they do a superb job. And there are some. They really are. But I suppose I'd make the general remark that the problem overwhelmingly with the media is their narrowness of perspective. They really do come from a very narrow cast. The ABC will tell you that it's diverse because they employ people of, I won't say both sexes, I'll say all sexes, and of all nationalities and cultures. But at the same time, the reality is that there is enormous lack of diversity in their views. And I think that is a real problem. And do I think we're losing the opportunity to implement good policy in this country because of a lack of sound debate? Absolutely. You can't get good policy without a good public debate. That's the motto line on my website, troops, if anybody's interested, johnanderson.net.au.
johnanderson.net.au, in case you missed that.
Where we try to model a civilised debate, and I have conversations with people sometimes at the absolute opposite end of the philosophical scale to me, but we're able to sit and talk like sensible human beings and find some common ground around things like the importance of free speech, quality debate, respecting one another enough to debate what they're saying, not attack them personally.
So, Peter, talking about media and the need for different perspectives, a variety of sources, How do you go merging media? What impact will that have?
Well, you know, it's funny. If you ask about the media here, most of us here are over 40, let's say. We think of print, television, radio. That's where we get our information from. Let me tell you, if this were an audience under 40, they don't really engage with print, radio, television. They get their news from Facebook, right? And I talk to my kids. My daughter will say to me, "Oh, I heard about such and such." "Oh, did you see it on TV?" "No." "Did you read it in the paper?" "No." "How do you know about it?" "Oh, someone put it up on Facebook." Right? Now, what's different about Facebook, which is probably the biggest media organisation in the world today, is there's no editor, right? No, nobody is sifting through it, checking it. No defamation applies, so you can defame anybody you like. You can impersonate somebody on Facebook, and they do. And you can whip it around the globe in a very small period of time. And this is what is meant by fake news. You know, fake news is actually a scientific concept. It's, you know, somebody sitting in St. Petersburg, probably working for the Russian security services, sets up a false account, puts on that false Facebook account that there's been a riot, let's say in Ohio, you know, may put up some doctored footage and can send it around the world in minutes, right? Because there's no editor that says, well, go and verify this story. There's nobody that says who's taken the footage. You know, there's nobody that says if I publish that, I might be liable for defamation, right? It's completely free of any editorial control at all. And there are people, believe me, that are just pumping out. Some of them are just like hackers, and some of them are state actors that are pumping out fake news. Now, this is very worrying because all our kids are getting their news from this source. And this really is affecting debate. So, that's number one. That is challenging the whole media model that we have grown up with. It's changing how people get information. So, what do the politicians try and do in response? Well, we know. You know, the highest political office in the world, President of the United States, he tweets. He tweets. 160 characters. That's what he does. And so now, if you want to know what Donald Trump is thinking, by the New York Times or the Washington Post, you follow him on Twitter, and you know, he will give out 2 or 3 tweets a day, and you know, that's how the policy of the United States government is now communicated. And by the way, you know, it's not just people like us that are following it. All the intelligence services of all the world are following Donald Trump on Twitter, because that gets you the message of what he's thinking much quicker. Now, the one thing about all of this new media environment is you've got diversity of opinion, believe me. You've got a million opinions. You can find any opinion you want on the internet at the moment. But what is the quality of it? How much of it can you trust? You know, and that's why I'd say the old media, and Trump calls it the old media, at least you know there's a bit of editorial control going on, right? And so it's likely to be more reliable than some Facebook that's being run by a bot out of St. Petersburg, which could take you in. So diversity actually is not a problem. John's just said here, he said go and look at John Anderson, or was it John Anderson? JohnAnderson.net.au, right? You know what he is? He's a publisher. He's a publisher.
Oh.
He is a publisher, and you want to read what he's publishing, go to johnanderson.net.au. There you go. You can, right? So the whole world, you've got to get this sort of idea that information is multiplied. It's multiplied billions of times, right? But the quality is going down all the time. And the other thing about cyberspace is people say the most despicable things in cyberspace. That the kind of stuff that you read, you know, I used to be a columnist, by the way, and they put your column up and then they let anybody who wants to write their view of what you've written. I would never read it. The stuff people say is shocking.
The Human Rights Commission doesn't try and do anything about hate speech there, do they?
Hate speech. It's the internet, you know, with the trolling and the comments, is the filthiest place you can imagine. If you want to see how bad human nature can be, just go and read some of this stuff. It's just awful. And the trouble is, you know, our kids are reading it and they are taking it seriously. This is a real big problem. Cyberbullying, what's going on. This is the world they inhabit now, you know. Whatever your complaints about old media, and I've got a few myself, the new media that's coming after it, it can be very, very good, like johnanderson.net.au, but it can be very, very bad as well. And I do worry, this is the thing that really worries me. I think this is changing the world. These companies like Facebook, like Apple, they are the biggest companies in the world, and essentially subject to very, very little editorial control. Now, I think Facebook went out the other day and it said, oh, we're going to clean up. They cleaned up, I don't know, was it a couple of 10,000, 30,000 something accounts. They just went out and took them off because they knew they were fake. But it worries me is you've only taken down, I think, 30,000. It's probably 300,000, 3 million. They will all have been replaced overnight, the ones they've taken down. Don't worry about that.
For a bit further elaboration on this really important point that Peter's raising, go to johnanderson.net.au, where you'll find an interview with Neil Ferguson, which I did about 2 months ago in San Francisco. Now, he's probably the world's leading economic historian, and he believes that social media is now making Western society so unstable and hatred is bubbling so close to the surface that it may break out into violence, that it may indeed make the Western world ungovernable. Now, that's a very profound thing to say, but it comes from one of the most thoughtful and I think trustworthy commentators in the world today. He goes on to say that it's a massive problem for governments because the Zuckerbergs of this world have massive power. They said their new platform would be good for democracy. They have now decided it's very bad for democracy because it was used against the things they believe in the case of Brexit and the election of Trump. So they're looking long and hard at how they can manipulate their own platforms to promote the views that they believe in, most of which I do not believe in, and probably most of which you would not believe in. And Ferguson makes the point that this is a nightmare for governments because the European approach of saying to these platform providers, do some censoring or we'll do it for you, well, what will they censor? It'll often be the very views that you and I and we've been talking about tonight because they don't fit the modern narrative. And he actually says that these services, they ought to be thought of more like the telephone. You pay your money, you put the call through. You post a letter, put a stamp on it, the postal service has to deliver it. Somebody else, other than those platforms, ought to decide what has to be pulled off. It's a very, very difficult area.
I just say one thing, and to me this is a huge issue, right? And I think about it a lot. They say...
I'll interview you on it.
Yeah, well, johnanderson.net.au.
And then put that on gaellebroad.com.au.
You know, they say we're just a carriage service, right? So you can't expect us to exercise any control. We're just like Australia Post.
I don't believe
If
it for a moment.
someone puts a letter through Australia Post, Australia Post got no responsibility for it, right? You know, and that's all we do. We just let people send it through our carriage. Now, I would say that's not right. You are, in fact, a publisher. You are publishing to the world. It's not a closed letter, by the way. It's open to the world. And if you are publishing to the world, you should be subject to the same responsibilities of a publisher. You shouldn't be able to defame people. You shouldn't be able to incite violence. You shouldn't be able to share terrorism. Now, they can take down stuff if they're forced to. Cost them a little bit of money. I'll give you an example. The US Congress has forced them to take down sexual slavery. You know, people were advertising sexual slavery. Right? They passed a law, they can take it down. They can take it down if they want to. Your bigger problem is this, I think, that what's going up on Facebook or Google is being decided by algorithms, and nobody really knows what's in these algorithms. And the algorithms can be weighted. They can be weighted to take certain stuff down. This is the point you're making.
Yeah, that's right.
Without you even knowing it,
That's
if
right.
that algorithm has changed, certain views can be taken down as well.
Yep.
Right? And so, again, you know, like all technology, this has got the capacity for great good, but it's got the capacity for great evil too. And there is really no regulation here. And the Americans are getting very interested in it because they're saying, hang on, you know, maybe foreigners have been interfering in our elections, right? And there's no doubt the Russians were doing something, but nobody quite knows what it was, right? And this is a thing that's, you know, don't think this doesn't happen in Australia, by the way. You know, we're just about... once upon a time I would have said to you, you know, we're sort of 10 years behind the US. But in this modern IT age, I'd say we're about 10 months behind the AS because it just speeded everything up.
Now, leadership is very important in politics. And John Anderson, you were a leader for 6 years of the Nationals at the federal level. You met or invited everyone for lunch every Thursday, I read, all your colleagues to talk about whatever. But what do you think makes a good leader?
Well, the essential ingredient, well, this sounds self-serving. It's probably why I had to leave. But the essential ingredient has to be character, as we said before. I really believe that. But I think a degree of empathy and of understanding, I think compassion is important. It's very interesting. I took a school group once to meet the CDF, Angus Houston, Chief of Defence Force. And they were school leaders from my old school in Sydney. And he said the first thing that a leader must possess if he's going to ask people to do things that they wouldn't, their mind says you shouldn't do, like hurl yourself at the enemy over the top of the trenches, they've got to believe that their leader is compassionate and cares about them and understands what they're really asking. Henry Ford II, of all people, the grandson of the car maker, was once asked for a definition of leadership, and he said, 3 essential elements. You've got to have the ability to set a vision. You've got to know what it is you're trying to achieve. You have to have the ability to articulate it to others so they know what it is. And thirdly, you've got to have about you the personal qualities to make them want to achieve that vision with you. But the Thursday lunches, interesting actually, I instituted that in my office at my own expense. I put on a very nice lunch because there was a dining room. It's amazing the double standard, you know, Peter. The Deputy Prime Minister's office in Canberra has a dining room. It wasn't in the original building, but a Labor Deputy Prime Minister decided he needed a dining room, so the rooms were changed and there was never any fuss. It never came up in the Senate estimates. There was no media scandal. I asked for the colour of my room. They said they were going to repaint it. And I said, could I have a soft green because there's a common colour? And they said, oh no, that'd be a media scandal. Meanwhile, the building had been redesigned for, previous, and no fuss. But in the interest of camaraderie, I used to host lunch there every Thursday, and it was very valuable because you get that informal time with people and they feel confident and they feel they can talk and you get a real feel for
Socialism means you never have to say sorry.
And I went there the other day, a very sad reflection. The ABC's not present, is it? No, they've gone. It is present. Look, an absolute aside. I went in the other day with a former colleague, and we decided we'd go up to the members and guests, senators' dining room, you know, behind the glassed-in area there. And I walked in, there was hardly any food on the sideboard, only about a third of the number of tables there used to be, and we were the only two people there at lunchtime. And in the old days, people used to congregate at lunch, Labor down one end and the Coalition down the other, but they were all there. And it was pretty valuable just for that interaction. There's something special about breaking bread with other human beings, isn't there? And when it's not happening, it tells you something sad. And when it is happening at its best, it's, oh, well, you know, it's, what was the great criticism of Christ? He's eating with the tax collectors. It was a sign of acceptance and of recognition and of valuing other people.
Well, a number of times this year already, it's been touted that Peter Costello is the only one that could unite Australian Conservatives and that he should return to Parliament.
There you go.
And given that you
How
are
silly
younger,
do you think Peter Costello is?
have you ruled it out?
I was going to say, Gaelle, I might be silly, but I'm not sure I'm that silly. You know, to be able to serve your country is a great honour. And, you know, to be frank, I feel very blessed to have had that opportunity. I really do. You know, I came from a pretty average home. My dad was a school teacher. He'd actually left school at 15 and qualified later in life to be a school teacher. And, you know, we pretty modest circumstances. You know, I think I had a good education and I worked hard and I had the opportunity to serve my country. And I always feel very privileged to have had that opportunity. And, you know, I do say, you know, if I can serve my country more, I'm very passionate about this country and I try and do it. I mean, you know, as you said in your introduction, at the moment I'm running our Sovereign Wealth Fund. You know, it's one of the few things that's making money for the taxpayers of Australia. And you know, I feel very proud of that. And if I get the opportunity to serve my country, I'll always take it and I'll always do it to the best of my ability. But I'm not considering coming back into politics and doing it in that way because I just feel you can't recreate something that's happened in the past. Is my view. I was there. I was honoured to do it. I did it to the best of my ability, and you know, maybe I can serve my country in new ways now.
Well done.
Now, I'll just ask a last question too, because we want to give time for people to ask questions. You've both written or been involved, I guess, in books that have recorded your story, but what's the next chapter for you, John?
Well, I hope there is one.
It's not finished yet.
Epilogue.
Footnotes. Look, you know, going on trying to make a contribution, I do very passionately believe that there's no such thing as good public policy without a decent debate. So I try and pursue that. I am involved with quite a bit of Christian work now. And I'm still very interested in research, so I'm involved in agricultural and transport research. Apart from that, you know, I'm a grandfather and now and enjoy very much having a time with family. And occasionally they feel spurred on by concern about just what sort of world my grandsons are going to inherit, the way things are going.
Now, do you have a favourite quote that you would like to finish on? Do you have, because politicians are often asked to give speeches, and I've worked for politicians, including this one over here, but yeah, they would often collect quotes, but do you have a favourite?
Robert Menzies, not often recalled, but in one of his radio chats when he was getting the Liberal Party running, said, democracy is not so much a machine as a spirit in which we recognise that whatever people's capabilities or place in our society is Our freedom is based on the recognition that every soul has equal worth in the eyes of heaven.
And what about you, Peter? Do you have a favourite quote to share?
I don't know if I can top that. That was be nice to your parents. That's what I'm using on my kids at the moment.
We'll take that. That's very good. Let's put our hands together for these two gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for making the trip at your own expense and your own time to support MADCOW and to engage with our community. We really do appreciate that. And on behalf of people here, and I assume I can get the support of the people here, but just we want to thank you for the contribution that you've made. Both of you have been nearly 20 years in public life in a full-time capacity and continue to be engaged in the conversation in Australia. So thank you so much.